All right, welcome back from lunch, everyone. So my name is Janet Salem, and I'm the founder of a clean tech startup called Footprint Lab, which I started after a long career with the UN, 17 years, to address a key issue which I found was on the table, which is that we don't know what's happening in supply chains when we make a financial decision. So we are voting for climate change, we're voting for other issues, biodiversity loss, modern slavery, every time we spend, lend or invest. But I know that through my work at the UN, we've had that kind of data available for over a decade. So my job with Footprint Lab is to convert that data into a format that can easily be integrated into financial data flows, especially now that everything is becoming digital. And we've had great traction. So the finance sector is really getting on board with this, starting with climate disclosures, but also now nature-based disclosures. So we're hoping that we can get more and more data into those data workflows that can show that when you make a decision, somewhere in that supply chain, you are voting for something, and you can make that decision to vote for something in a positive way or a negative way if you have that data available. And I'm pleased to say that there are policy measures coming that reinforce this, such as, we've talked about the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU that requires these carbon footprints to come to light before those imports into the EU can occur. But we also see the EU is moving ahead with digital product passports that create a digital ledger with different stamps of the whole supply chain, where this SDG data, ESG data, can be entered into this digital ledger. So this kind of transparency, where these interactions between energy decisions and other social and environmental issues are occurring, will become more and more transparent. Now, over to our panel. What I want to focus on is these intersections between energy transition and sustainable development, and we'll hear from different perspectives. So can I start with Gopalika? Can you just set the scene and explain how does the energy transition affect other social and environmental issues? And is it often positive or is it negative? What do you see?
Thank you for your question, Janet. I think from our 2 days of very insightful discussions, we have already established the fact that energy is the lifeblood of development. But at the same time, the quest for better livelihoods, better healthcare, sufficient food and clean water also sort of drives the moral and practical imperative to shift towards the cleaner sources of energy. So that's the positive side. That's the positive side of this intersection. But we have now gotten repeated reminders that we cannot succeed in achieving these energy transition goals unless and until we also focus on the broader sustainable development agenda and development objectives. And currently we are off track on almost all SDGs. And if we speak in terms of timeline, I think we have arrived at half time, but we are not anywhere near halfway in achieving goals. So given this context, and also as we move from crisis to crisis, it is also important to acknowledge that only a very short period of time is left to understand this very integrated nexus consisting of water, food, energy, and health, and the modeling of the real-life interdependencies and the practical interlinking of SDGs for the development of cost-effective solutions, both from financial as well as socio-economic point of view, is now very, very essential. From a policy perspective, I think we need to align the climate, energy, and development policies to sort of triangulate the benefits and sort of triangulate rather core benefits of sector development plans rather than relying on single sector isolated policies for delivering sustainable outcomes. On the other hand, the alignment of such broad agendas will also require massive investment. That will not only be enabled with good policies, but also with a lot of finance. So going forward, I think we need to revisit the global climate finance architecture and definition to align its structure, flow, and scale with the climate finance of the developing country. I will circle back on this point later in the discussion. as
Okay.
well.
So we need to integrate this intersection or this interaction between the energy transition and other issues into finance. But tell me, is the money being put on the table for sort of climate-friendly energy transition, is that being taken away from development finance? You know, is this a dichotomy that we have to choose from, or can we have both?
So I think funding for climate action and funding for development is not necessarily a zero-sum game, because there are cases, I know that there have been cases in the past where the funds were diverted from development aid and fronted as climate finance, especially when we talk about the G7 countries and the climate finance that was provided by them. Most of it came from the development aid budgets. So it is definitely a gray area for the countries, and therefore there should be focus on those projects which derive dual benefits and are mutually benefiting to each other. So here the development agenda complementing climate goals is a win-win situation. Also, I think when we talk about climate finance, we talk about the geographical disparity, the disparity that exists at the source, the public versus private debate. But I think we also need to give importance to the sectoral disparities and the cost of inaction, because the energy and transport sector, we know, account for more than half of the total climate finance that is being dispersed and mobilized. And given that these projects have become commercially viable today, it is easier to draw a business case scenario for them in comparison to the projects in, say, agriculture or forestry or land use. So we know that private finance readily flows into these commercially viable projects, but if we have to attract investments in projects where social outcomes are clear, but the financial outcomes are not, then we need to calculate or demonstrate the cost of inaction, which can be the cost of past negligence or the cost of adaptation or the cost of reskilling the workforce and the communities that have so far remained at the center of social disparities. Because I think at the end of the day, displaced communities and financially constrained consumers will not be able to sustain business as usual profits. Therefore, linking of the ESG and SDG key performance indicators to direct finance towards climate and development becomes very.
Okay, thank you. Well, then let's go to an example on the ground. So if we go to Brian, your organisation, Power for All, and I was saying it sounds like powerful all, but if we want power for all so they can become powerful, tell us why is it important that we talk about the energy transition for farmers producing food? Why is it relevant for them to go for clean energy, and are there some co-benefits? Are there some co-bad impacts? Some trade-offs? How does it work on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Power for All works globally with partners to end energy poverty through deployment of decentralized renewable energy solutions. Now, our work in Uganda, Ethiopia, and India takes us very close to smallholder farmers. Now, we know that the food system globally is heavily energy intensive. I think 30% of the world's energy is consumed by the food system. Now, the most interesting statistic is 80% of that 30% is fossil fuel powered. So that already shows you that the food system is heating up the planet.
But doesn't that dependence on fossil fuels put the farmers at risk in terms of all these price fluctuations and volatility we've seen?
Certainly. So, I mean, we've seen what the global crisis, be it the wars in the Middle East, or even COVID, did to the supply chains. So each time there's volatility in supply, the prices go up. And for people that, for instance, in Africa, that import most of their fuel from these regions, it means that the price for a liter of diesel or petrol would go up even 50%. Now, this already throws their calculations off balance. Reliance on equipment like fossil fuel pumps. One contributes to the climate situation, but also has challenges like breakdown every now and then. So you cannot really have a productive farming cycle because of this. So our focus on shifting to cleaner alternatives like solar-powered water pumping, we see is a viable solution because a solar water pump, even though it may be expensive at the upfront for an ordinary farmer, has a longer lifetime value, but also is cheaper in the long term.
So if it makes sense in the long term to switch from the fossil fuel-based pumping to the solar water pump, why don't the farmers do it? Why do they need power for all?
Yeah. So I'm a farmer, interestingly. So on the side, I do some horticulture. The average cost of a water pump in Uganda, solar water pump, is between $800 and $1,000.
How does that compare to a salary?
So now, a normal smallholder farmer, that is not me, will earn anywhere between $600 to $800 per harvest season. So you're asking them to fork out $800 upfront to pay for this equipment, yet they've got competing financial obligations. So they
half of their annual salary would be this capital investment.
Precisely. Not very many farmers can afford that. So we really need to come up with innovative financing options that will enable smallholder farmers afford most of this technology if they're going to transition. Yeah.
So walk us through. So they've made you've given them some finance, microfinance, to buy the renewable energy pump. So there's been an energy transition. Now they're producing food. Can you just talk us through briefly what are the co-benefits here?
Yeah.
What's happened?
Co-benefits. One, when they produce more, they can employ more people on the farms, but also there's more money in their pockets. When a farmer produces more, they don't rely on aggregation to be able to sell to the market. If I'm producing, let's say, 2 tons of tomatoes, and I was previously producing just 100 kilos, I do not have to rely on selling jointly with my neighbors to be able to access the market. I can go to the market directly, so I cut out that middleman. Also, I create more jobs because I need more hands on farm now. The other benefit is for the women. The biggest majority of farmers in the global south are actually women. So adding renewable energy options for power to them helps them deal with the burden of having to collect, for instance, collect energy resources for the household, also use less time, for instance, to collect water to irrigate their crops because that they already have on farm. So there are so many attendant benefits of using renewable energy for the smallholder farmer.
Okay, that sounds good. Sounds like a viable project for Richard. So you're an impact investor. So you're expecting, if you invest in an energy transition project, you are expecting a variety of co-benefits that relate to sustainable development. Can you run us through what is it that you're looking for in projects and what kind of data are you looking for when you review those applications?
Yeah, so we're an equity investor, which means we're not looking at a short-term return of just capital and interest, but we're looking at a multiplier on the capital we're putting in sustainable businesses. Our filter for us is impact, which means that it needs to create access or make the product more affordable, ensure for inclusivity, just like the gender aspect he talked about, and have a broader environmental impact. The way we do it, we actually spend a lot of time with founders to understand how they measure that impact, what it looks like today, and what is it going to be in the next 3, 4, 5 years. Because measuring that impact is just as important, and we've seen enough and more happen in the market today where folks like to check a box and say, I have done this, and it's creating impact and it's saving, X tons of emissions. But really what we want to make sure is there's intentionality behind it. And today for those projects, it's important that we're setting a baseline when we enter, we measure it all the way till we exit, to make sure that both the financial as well as the impact incentives are met.
And I mean, you're an impact investor, but you're still an investor. So the people whose money you have, they still want a return. So how does that work? What kind of data do they want to see, or what kind of results do they want to see? Is supporting projects that support low-income populations, is it actually a good investment?
It's an excellent investment. So data has proven that, especially in India. And our investment bank has facilitated, I think, like 53 exits today, and the median return on that is 43%. So it's a very healthy return, and it's definitely possible. All of these companies were looking at creating both impact and generating returns because our investors are expecting for both. They're not expecting for just one. And so is it possible to do it? Definitely is.
And so what makes an impact investor, if you're getting great returns, so why is the impact important? Is it because you're accepting smaller deal volumes, or is it because you have the capacity or the domain knowledge to look at this? Or is it because the people with the money are just interested in doing good for society? I mean, what makes, if the profits are there, why do we need impact investment?
I think it's a great question. A lot of the impact capital, historically, at least in India, has come in the very, very early stages where companies are just beginning to take off, where impact maybe outweighs returns. But over time, these have to be businesses that create the same kind of returns as any other enterprise would. So for the stage that we invest in, it's about elongating the runway. But at the same time, both are equally important. So if you can't build a sustainable business that generates the returns, it would be very hard for me to return that capital back to my LPs who are looking for both. And honestly, today in the market, if you look at it, a lot of the private equity investors, and Dhanpal can talk to this, are actually coming in and investing in these companies that we would have invested in the first or second round, just because they're really good, both impact as well as financial outcomes.
So could we say, let's say you've invested in Brian's project, he's going to expand to India, then you invest, you see the co-benefits, and you get your 3-5x return on investment. Are we now ready for investment from Dhanpal? What kind of energy projects are you looking for, and how do you expect them to perform financially? Do you take a hit on the returns in exchange for renewable, sustainability, climate action, or are you also expecting good returns?
Janet, thanks, and really happy to be here. I've been super excited by the level of quality of discussions that's been taking place over the last couple of days. I was actually complimenting Saurabh on putting together a great event. I think as equity investors, inherently we are taking risk. And we do understand that when we put in equity, there's a risk of losing capital. But the flip is that, return and risk are two sides of the same coin. We clearly are optimists by nature. And as we look for capital to, work, we expect that we will make a certain type of returns. I think in the climate space, if you look at what's happened over the last 5 years, is there's a little bit of that barbell effect which has taken place.
Sorry?
Barbell effect.
Okay.
On one side, there's a lot of money chasing new climate ventures in the climate tech broadly space. And the other side, you've got commercially, I would say, proven climate business models, say utility scale renewables, etc. Again, where there's a lot of large capital which is flowing in. But there's this big missing middle where businesses, companies, which have kind of got some start, don't have the capital to scale it very rapidly. And that's where we as a business focus on what we call the missing middle, where we look to invest in proven technologies, we look to invest in building innovative business models, which are solving a climate problem, but very clearly creating a sustainable business model by eventually driving what I believe any business has to do is driving profitability, right? But it takes time, it takes effort, because a lot of these business models, you need to also be building ecosystems around it. It's not just about building that business. I think what Brian mentioned around the fact that what he's doing with, the energy problem and using financing as an innovating tool to make it more accessible. I think the world is going to have to think about innovation as it looks to drive climate impact and climate outcomes.
But so you're investing in, you differ slightly because you're investing in innovations. You're not sure, is it going to work? Is it going to scale?
Innovation, not in technology, but innovation in business models. Okay, the subtle difference
example.
over there is,
do you have a favorite?
let me give you 2 examples. We've built an electric mobility business in India, which is using electric buses as a form factor. And it's addressing 2 problems. One is a problem of essentially public transportation, where we see currently utilities using diesel and CNG-based buses, but we are actually able to offer solutions providing electric buses which are economically more competitive than for the same utility to use diesel buses to transport people. And we're taking that model and now actually delivering direct mobility services to consumers, intercity mobility services, where we're using electric to basically, again, provide those solutions. Where the cost at which we are delivering that solution, again, is very competitive to what diesel buses are currently offering. The second model is what we are doing in converting waste into wealth. Solid waste, municipal, agricultural waste, which we are taking, we are processing it at scale, and that's where the capital factor comes in. Extracting methane and converting into renewable natural gas, 100%. Completely commercial model, but it requires scale to become profitable. Okay, so these are just two examples, but in this, the entire ecosystem of collecting waste from 5,000 farmers, transporting it and storing it for 10 months in the year because it's only a post-harvest cycle that you get the feedstock. Being able to create technologies which actually work at scale, extract, and these are almost 99% methane capture technologies. And then finally, selling it as a commodity, which is replacing what is a fossil fuel commodity, and therefore 100% green, required us to work with, I would say, policymakers, required us to work with an entire supply chain ecosystem, with many EPC companies, contractors who didn't have the technology and working to bring in the technologies and build these plants. Now that's, I would say, innovation at scale to drive business outcomes, not to necessarily build a new way of, carbon capture or methane extraction.
Can I ask, so we've got energy transition for food with Brian. You're also looking at energy transition in food, but mobility and waste. And you mentioned policy. Do you think there's a need to consider this intersectionality in the policies? And if so, which one's the most powerful policy? Is it the transport policy, food policy? Is it health? Your electric buses will be reducing a bit of urban emissions. Which policymakers need to be involved?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we are at the intersection of pretty much every part of the economy. And I call it the 4 C's, whether it's a country, the corporate, the citizen, or capital, all 4 have to work together in sync. Because what we are addressing is completely changing the way we consume energy, right? 80% of our energy consumption today is in the form of molecules, only 20% in the form of electrons. And this is vis-a-vis India, right? As we move to electrification of the transportation system, you're going to see a massive shift in the way these molecules are being consumed and electrons are being consumed. So I just think that the world has to innovate, governments have to innovate, and we as capitalists also have to innovate in the way we invest capital. That's
great. I have a follow-up question. Yesterday we heard from Andrew Forrest, who said we need to do away with fossil fuel subsidies. So let's say he convinces the world to do away with fossil fuel subsidies, and now you're revisiting all the investment proposals in front of you. How much does that change the business case? I think we don't like to underwrite as an investor a subsidy program which is, say, long-term in nature, because you're fundamentally investing in a flawed business model. Why I say flawed? Because if the business cannot produce economic gains, right, that business doesn't need to be a business, then it's something else. It's a social enterprise, or it's something that the government is doing. So why is there so much investment in fossil fuels when they're so highly subsidized? Why don't investors So I think away? The definition of subsidies needs to be understood better. You will go into many, I would say, energy surplus economies where they actually sell gas at an explicit subsidy to the cost of extracting the oil and gas. But economies which are dependent, like India, they actually, the subsidy is more implied, it's implicit, it's not explicit, in the fact that the carbon cost of that subsidy is not captured into the price of the fuel, right? And I think that's where the question of affordability and the question of whether the economy can sustain that additional cost, because you need
Today, you can't just switch, right? There's no magic button to switch from fossil to non-fossil. It's a transition, and it has to be a just transition. So the journey is going to be painful. The journey has to require many, many stakeholders to take that share of the burden. And to whatever extent, I think this cost, right? I think IMF has come out with a $7 trillion global subsidy on fossil fuels. And this has gone up over the last couple of years because of COVID and the lower cost and being absorbed by governments, et cetera. And that by the end of this decade is likely to be to $8.3 trillion. And on the flip side, if you look at it, climate investment, again, as per many studies, requires between 4 trillion and 6 trillion. So if in an ideal world where you had one balance sheet to manage, you could figure out a way to kind of use this capital and basically apply it to the other. But unfortunately, very, very complicated world there. We have many stakeholders, and we need to manage through that process.
Yeah. So some of those stakeholders obviously are the workers in these industries. So maybe I can turn to Michael Williamson from ESCAP, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. You're the head of the energy division. So when you talk to member states, are they concerned if they invest in the energy transition at the macro level, they're doing it at the cost of jobs? Is this a dichotomy, or is this tell us this is a false dichotomy, jobs versus energy transition?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. And first of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for the invite to take part. It's been a very enjoyable couple of days so far. I think, yes, this is a key issue. All politicians are worried about jobs. Usually when there's an election, the Prime Minister tells his ministers, I've got 3 priorities, jobs, jobs, and jobs. That's the usual story that we hear. And I guess the challenge here is that how do we work with countries and encourage them to go aggressively down this path of energy transition when they have these fears and concerns? So I think to a large extent, if we see bumps on the road, we should try and smooth them out. We know there's lots of jobs in the fossil fuel sector. They tend to be concentrated around where the resources are, where the coal is, where the oil and where the gas is. But over the years, especially in coal, the level of employment has declined. Why is that? It's because of automation. And indeed, in some regions of the world, like Europe, they're using less coal. But the big picture...
But the fossil fuel industries, they have these amazing campaigns showing, that hardworking blue-collar worker in a mine, are they using them as a human shield when actually it's mostly moving towards automation and white-collar jobs? I mean, is that a fantasy?
Well, I don't think anybody would support the argument that we continue on the current carbon-intensive path because of any kind of perception of job impacts in this limited way. Like, you're from Australia, right, Janet? If I told you there's more people working in cafes than there are in the coal industry, I mean, that's a fact, right?
So we need Big Cafe to get involved.
Exactly. But the big picture is the transformation that we're undertaking, which will take a few decades, is a path towards a future with not just more jobs, but better quality jobs. Because if you look across the board, on the basis of jobs per dollar invested, there's more jobs in the energy efficiency and the renewables than there is in coal. So in renewables, depends on the technology, whether it's geothermal or solar or wind, it's between about 7.2 and 7.6 jobs per $1 million invested. For coal, it's about 3.1. So the numbers are there. But I think, and also energy efficiency has got about the same levels as renewable energy. So when we're building energy efficient buildings, or we're doing retrofits, or weatherization of homes, this creates a lot of jobs. But I think this is giving us comfort, but there's a couple of hidden traps inside there. The hidden trap, I think, is that the new jobs will be in different places and involve different skills to the old jobs. And that's where governments come in. Can they give this adjustment package, this transition package, that help workers make that jump? I think that's, when we talk about adjustment packages, that's what comes in. But one of the solutions is when we look at repurposing these existing sites and these assets from the fossil fuel sector. Take coal-fired power stations as an example. A lot of them are being retired. What do you do with that land? You're not going to get farmers want to move in there. You're not going to build houses. So you look at things like battery energy storage. You already have the grid connection there. That's a lot of the cost. You're looking at large-scale wind and solar, and maybe even pump solar because you have these underground caverns. So you're only limited by your imagination.
All right. So I might just do a quick round. Wait, before I let you off the hook, Michael, again, Secretary General of the UN has said we should end fossil fuel subsidies. Enough with that. How does that play out? Do you agree? And how does that play out when you talk to member states of ESCAP?
Okay, we've been banging this drum for a long time. We collectively, international organizations, over the past 10 years, the needle hasn't shifted much on fossil fuel subsidies. They dipped during COVID because we used less energy. Now they're back up to where they were before COVID. The underlying reason for that is that politically it's a tough pill to swallow because people like cheap energy, it gets votes. Fossil fuel subsidies get in the way of action on climate because they distort the market for renewables and energy efficiency, but also they stand in the way of leave nobody behind. So 2030 Agenda talks about leave nobody behind. The richer people benefit more from the fossil fuel subsidies. We have to keep chipping away with this message.
Okay, great. All right, before we go to Q&A time, I want everyone just to share one key message that is important to you related to this topic. And if you could also just indicate who you'd like to know this and what should they do about it. Perhaps I can start with you, Danpal.
Climate investing is a real opportunity. One can make money, one has to be patient, and I think it requires all forms of capital providers to come in on the table and make this happen.
So anyone managing money, invest in clean energy.
It's the greatest opportunity, I would say one of the 3 biggest opportunities of the next 2 decades.
Okay, great. Gopalika?
I think we need to prioritize building the capacity of government departments, financial institutions, and regulators, because empowering these entities with knowledge and tools for crafting transition plans, conducting the climate scenarios analysis, ensuring transparency through disclosures is definitely needed.
So we need to support these policy drafters with better
Absolutely.
training and maybe some research or expertise, maybe mobilize the universities to support them. Yeah? Great. Okay. Richa, what do you want people to know?
Similar to Dhanpal, but I think we need more capital to flow into this space. I think there's a lot of talk and very little actual capital movement that's going into innovative companies that are looking to solve these problems. We need to find a way to direct more of that in.
Is there a pipeline of projects to meet the capital?
Yeah, there's a fantastic pipeline, but there's a valley of death where companies are not getting funded because there just isn't enough capital movement in.
Yeah, amen. Okay, Brian.
I think mine would be policy and finance. So policy makers, national governments, government partners that support them have to move from policy intention to concrete action. So we need to see more equitable financing towards renewable energy industry. We've heard about the climate finance, but only 4% is going to the food systems. Yet, like I said, the food systems are contributing 30% to the emissions. So we really need to be more intentional, but also practical about how we're funding this transition.
So policy needs money to actually work on the ground. Yeah. Okay, great. Michael?
I think the message for governments is that the energy transition will bring a lot of new jobs in the future, and it's imperative to get the nations ready for this in terms of the skills development, the education, particularly the focus on STEM, and use this as an opportunity to correct their gender balance in the energy workforce, which at the moment stands at 16% globally. That needs to be fixed.
So is this a jobs policy, or who are we talking to? Is this universities, schools, or ministries of education?
I think we need to look at ministries of education and ministries of labour about the whole life cycle from kindergarten through to bachelor's degree. How do we optimize that process to be able to capitalize on these opportunities?
So if green jobs, skills development is not in your plan, it needs to be added.
Correct.
Right, okay, good. I think I'll also have a key message. Mine is that the environmental analysis world has enormous amounts of data that can be integrated into financial data. So anyone that manages money data, whether you're a fintech or a bank or a tech fin, you need to layer in this ESG data so that people can make informed decisions. And with that, I'm opening up questions. Does anyone have questions to our esteemed, panelists? How do I decide? Do we start from this side? So who has a mic? Yeah, okay, go for it.
So my question is to Michael Williamson. Thank you for this amazing expose. And as you started, it's about jobs, 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 and especially for politicians. I am a member of parliament from Mauritius, and coming from a small island developing state, SIDS, as your concluding remark is, so to be able to transition and harmonize this, it's about exactly having all those ministries working together. You mentioned the Ministry of Labor, you mentioned the Ministry of Education, but my question to you is, as you're saying, to reduce the gender gap, to have the youth on board, and especially because when we talk about SDGs, which are universal in approach, but still for all nations to adopt, it's still specific and local context. So how and what would you suggest or advise for SIDS, and especially what kind of collaboration or multilateral agreement or cooperation can be made for small island developing state, or especially South-South cooperation, for instance, or even UN-EU cooperation? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question, and indeed a tough one to answer. I think for every country, they need to figure out what is their comparative advantage. And for smaller countries, you have diseconomies of scale, you have very long supply lines, you have a range of challenges to scaling up clean energy. So it's a question of figuring out what are the comparative advantages, what is the technology mix that will work. And for example, in Mauritius, how do industries like tourism, how can they be close coupled with solar, and what sort of skills development you need? I think the real challenge with SIDS is that reliance on imported energy really creates a situation where the global price volatility affects them much more than other countries. And I think that's a plus point for the approach using renewable energy and energy efficiency, but you can't rely completely on outside skills. You've got to build those skills up from inside.
Okay, thank you. I think one more, if I can take one more.
Myself, Amardeep Darade. I'm a CEO and founder of Panchatattva Fusion Private Limited. So we are into green hydrogen production, sustainable aviation fuel sector, and ethanol production. So thank you first of all for providing me the opportunity. My question is related to CBAM. Yesterday, the Union Minister, Commerce Minister, he said that, EU's CBAM proposal is unfair and it's going to hit them only, their manufacturing sector and all. So CBAM, it's looking like more like a foreign policy tool to, leverage the things, other things and all, right? So why can't EU think, and in fact, UN should intervene in it as a global platform to, make some arrangements to make it more flexible to the developing countries as well. So your point of view, sir, I would like to know, sir. Michael, sir.
That I don't have too much to say on, I must say, because we're really focused more on the Asia Pacific.
I mean, if I can jump in on this, I think CBAM, it may not be popular for everyone, but the intention has logic. The EU cannot continue to develop its economy by outsourcing emissions. So it needs to work with its importers to reduce emissions of its imports. I mean, that's just as simple as it is. It needs to happen. And we should decarbonize ASAP with preference to those who are unfairly affected by it. But the logic of it, it's well-intentioned. All right, so on this note, I'd like to thank the audience for your kind attention and my wonderful panelists for a very interesting session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet.